As we began worship today, I mentioned that we're celebrating the gift of water and what it means that water is provided for us so abundantly, especially here in the beautiful, verdant Willamette Valley. It's a great gift that the streams, the riverbeds, the wells flow with abundant water. And in the scriptures that we've shared today, we hear about how God gives the gift of water in the wilderness and causes the deserts to begin flowing with living waters. Today, I want to introduce you to a clergy minister colleague of mine, a friend of mine. He'll be joining us on video in a moment. Reverend Todd Bartlett is the executive director of Camp and Retreat Ministries in Oregon, Idaho for our United Methodist Church, and actually the Episcopal Church has joined us as well in Oregon and Idaho. Todd has been in ministry here in Oregon for some 30 years, and so we've been colleagues for that long. He originally grew up outside of Minneapolis, where he enjoyed playing in the creeks that were full of salamanders and crawdads. In high school, he was very active in scouting and in camp ministries. And right out of high school, he worked for a summer helping in maintenance in a local United Methodist campground. And that planted some seeds for him of the significance of outdoor ministry and camping ministries. Here in Oregon, he served several churches as pastor before becoming the director of the Collins Retreat Center, which many of you may know is not far from here, about 30 minutes from here, essentially up the Clackamas River and then up Deep Creek. The Deep Creek flows through Collins Retreat Center grounds. And Todd became the director there in 2008, just at the time that many of us remember was kind of the bursting of economic bubble. And it was a difficult time for many different kinds of activities and services, including camp and retreat ministries. But it happened to coincide with a very particular event when a series of winter storms scoured out the creek bed at Deep Creek. And that spring was the first time in many years that coho salmon returned to Deep Creek. That triggered a significant interest on Todd's part. He later on became involved in what's called the Clackamas River Basin Council. And currently, in addition to his full-time job as executive director of Camp and Retreat Ministries, he's now serving as president on the board of the Clackamas River Basin Council. Todd and his wife Laura live close by to us here in Milwaukee, and Todd and I had a chance to visit for a little bit recently. If we could, I'd like to show that first map, Elizabeth, if we could share that. Great. So this is an image of the Clackamas River watershed from the bottom right-hand corner, which is the highest elevation southwest. That is the headwaters, if you will, of the Clackamas River in the Mount Hood National Forest. The black lines are kind of basins or sub-watersheds within the larger Clackamas River Basin. And it comes flowing downstream then through the forests into the agricultural land. And the yellow there is the urban area. And so that's where you'll find places like Oregon City and Boring and Damascus. Of course, the Clackamas River flows into the Willamette River between us and Oregon City at Clackamas Park. So all of this is part of the Clackamas River Basin. We know that over 300,000 people in Clackamas County do get their drinking water directly from the Clackamas River, in addition to those of us here in Milwaukee who enjoy water that comes from the aquifer beneath the surface, some 200 to 300 feet below the surface of where we are right now. Let's go ahead and show the second slide now. This is a slide of a riparian zone. And for those of you who are not familiar with that term, the riparian zone is everywhere from the very edge of the water up into the slopes that feed that riverbank. The riparian zone, according to our friend Todd, is one of the richest and also one of the most vulnerable areas of life in their watershed. And that's because of all the plants, the microorganisms, the animals, how they all impact the watershed. I'm sure many of you remember the wildfires of a year and a half ago, and how some of those fires burnt right down to the edge of the Clackamas River. And so there are still areas far up the river where it's completely devastated with fire, right down to the water. And this is something we especially need to pay attention to, because as climate changes, while we may still have abundant water flowing throughout the year, the fire seasons are going to become longer and more intense, and the rain is going to fall in more intense events. And in those situations, there'll be greater propensity to flooding. So all of this brings to question, how can we better care for our watershed, our Clackamas River Basin? And a term that was new to me a couple of years ago that may be new to many of you here in the room and those of you on Zoom is a term called watershed stewardship or watershed discipleship. You're familiar, I'm sure, with the understanding of, think globally and act locally. So watershed stewardship is a way of enacting that says, yep, we care about God's whole creation. We care about the entire world. And the place where we may be in a position to make the greatest difference is right here within our own watershed. It also speaks of us, again, of this community of life, of this of the watershed teeming with life, that riparian zone, and what it means to care for that. So one of the projects, or many projects, of the Clackamas River Basin Council has been repairing or restoring these riparian zones. And that, again, is how Todd first became aware of the Water Council, was because they were doing a project right there at the Collins Retreat Center in Deep Creek. So now I want to go ahead and ask Elizabeth to play the video for us, about 10 minutes conversation between Todd and I about watershed stewardship and the importance, the spirituality, and the importance of stewarding these riparian zones. Wonderful. So going back to the time where you began serving at Collins, you have been living in the Clackamas River watershed for quite a few years now. So tell us a little bit about your understanding of this concept that's new for many of us of watershed stewardship or watershed discipleship.
Sure. Yes, Collins is in the Clackamas River Basin. Deep Creek flows through that property. And water has been an important element for my life for all of as far back as I can remember. And there is this sense for me about, if we care for this environment, if we take that role of stewardship seriously, there is much that will be provided for us. And if we don't take care of it, we will suffer the consequences. And we've seen that with all kinds of polluted environments around the country. And, to be involved with the Deep Creek and that portion of the Clackamas River Basin Council, I think one of the things that really brought that alive to me was my first fall there. So that was 2009. We had some guests who were on site and they said, there's fish in the creek. And I thought, wow, I've not seen any fish. Well, it was the returning of the coho. That experience, and I went down and was able to get some video and some pictures. That experience really connected me to that watershed in a way that I hadn't been connected to before. And that there was this vital life in the creek that I didn't know existed because I hadn't been there the previous fall and didn't know. And I did come to find out that it had been several years since locals had seen salmon in that creek. What had happened in between, right at the end of '08, was a large snowfall and then warming and a large amount of rain. And so there was flooding, which scoured out the creek and created gravel beds again that made it possible for the salmon to be there. So there's this provision of life, even though I didn't fish for the salmon there. There's this teeming of life both in the creek, and then the riparian zone is some of the most life-filled spaces that we know in this world. So that's that, where are the edges? And that's part of what the stewardship for me, how do we care for those edges, but how do we enter into them when we start to talk about watershed spirituality, theology? It's those edge places that are so teeming with life. And it might be scary to take that step into those edge places, but it's so exhilarating and life-giving that it's really worth venturing into those edge places. We're comfortable in the center, right? or close to the center, but it's really pushing out the edges. That's where action and life really takes place.
Hey, say a little bit more for yourself personally, Todd, about the significance of those edges teeming with life and how that strikes you in your heart and in your spirit.
So I remember growing up, this was, we lived in a suburb of Minneapolis, but there were creeks nearby, and we would go get tadpoles and crayfish and just play in that water and experience that fullness of life that was there, and to be awestruck by the beauty and wonder of these creatures. So that's one piece. I think the other piece for me, so I made the transition from local church pastoring to the Collins Retreat Center at the end of 2008. Now, if you think back, for those who have some sense of the history there, that was the bursting of an economic bubble that we'd had. And it was, in some ways, logically speaking, it was the worst time to go to the Collins Retreat Center. We were, lots of adults were cutting back on their expenses, and there wasn't a lot of activity happening there. But for me, there was this sense of invitation, God's invitation to call me into that place away from what had become, a pretty comfortable environment, serving a local church. I'd been doing that for 18 years. And while there were always challenges, there was still something familiar and not always easy, but there was some ease to it in that comfort, right? And now stepping into this role where I had all kinds of skills that I could employ in this space, but it was a new role and there were many things to learn. And, I went from 2 toilets to 33 toilets. And plumbing is not one of my greater skills, but I learned a lot. And I think it's that, learning is important to me. And it's when we go to those edge places, that's when we get to learn both what about our own capacities, that we often have greater capacity than we thought we had. And we get to learn about others and other beings, whether it's crayfish and tadpoles or coho salmon, whatever it is. the richness that's there for us to learn and to interact with and grow is just amazing.
We know that there are a lot of efforts throughout the Northwest in terms of stream and riparian zone restoration. It strikes me that these boundary places, these edge places, are places of great vulnerability. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, we know that. So I was just at a meeting last night, and we had some reporting back on some temperature study that was done in the Clackamas River Basin Council recently, and we know that salmon and trout depend upon cold water to thrive, and the places where we've removed the trees away from the river, away from the creeks that feed into the river, saw some temperatures this last year. You might remember that it was extremely hot in June, way ahead of where we would normally expect those temperatures to come. And there were sections of the creeks that actually exceeded the survival temperature for fish. So there are species that are very vulnerable. But for us, yes, the vulnerability, when we talk about that word, we often think about, danger. And yet what really is provided for us by opening our hearts and allowing ourselves to be vulnerable is to learn and experience something else outside of ourselves. And then we have the potential to take that into us and shape our lives differently than we've been shaped. So, there's the vulnerability of riparian zones that have disappeared, and we need to reestablish them because there's not just the riparian zones are vulnerable, but then anything that's dependent upon that is vulnerable. But those riparian zones in our own lives can provide us growth, as we've talked about, but also some shade on hot days when we need that edge to encounter what's alive. And God is there. I have this image that works for me personally of God being somewhat of in this scene that I have, the forest is there, and it's the edge of the forest. And God is sort of playing hide and seek, but in a playful way and never really hidden. Just, kind of always peeking out from behind the trees, or always being clearly visible and yet playful. And so for me, part of that riparian zone when it comes to faith is that encountering God in a playful way and in a life-giving way.
Well, in addition to the ways that the physical environment and how literally the Clackamas River basin that we live in, that nurtures our lives, and the importance of these very, very vulnerable riparian zones, these zones that are in between on the water edges, the edges between the water, the stream, and the surrounding forest. In addition to understanding that in terms of stewardship of our physical environment, I think it also provides for us a wonderful metaphor symbolizing our life as a congregation. And I'm thinking particularly of if the congregation is the stream, as it were, and then the neighbors around us as that riparian zone? And then where are those edge places where there's two things come up next to each other, where there's opportunity for interaction and growth? And what does vulnerability in those places look like? And how can we live into God's call for us to be investing our time and energy, our lives in those edge places? So I do have something specific in mind, which was that just last Monday, we had a wonderful, life-giving, and joyful gathering of new friends for us here in John Wesley Hall. There were 8 or so Latina Spanish-speaking women, part of a group affiliated with Lot Whitcomb Elementary School next to us, just a mile from us. This particular group of women are known as the Madres de Corazón, or Mothers of Heart. All of them have had children who've attended Lot Whitcomb Elementary School at some point. All of them speak Spanish as their first or primary language. All of them do speak and understand some English, but they're certainly more comfortable, more at home in Spanish. This group has pre-existed the pandemic, and during the pandemic, they've been meeting regularly online, as many of us have. However, this past Monday was their first in-person gathering for 2 years, in person for the first time since the pandemic began. And they met here at our church because I was excited about the opportunity to open literally our hearts, our doors, to our minds, to this group of women. And it was truly a joyous, joyous occasion. The other really important edge place or point of connection is that 3 of the same families who are part of the Madres de Corazón group have now registered to participate in the Milwaukee Community Garden and in the garden beds that are here on our site at St. Paul's. I believe now this is either the 12th or 13th season since the community gardens were established here at St. Paul's. Up until this point, the garden information, the registration, the rules, all that has only been available in English. So with another community partner, we worked together to have the information translated into Spanish so that it would be more readily available to these Spanish-speaking participants. And at the conclusion last Monday of the Madres meeting, the Milwaukee Community Garden coordinator, Lisa Lashbrook, was here, and we had an opportunity to kind of bring these edges together, if you will, the garden edges with the neighborhood edges of Madres, and that St. Paul's Church was the safe place where they could meet together on common ground. So I think for us, it brings some wonderful opportunities. I am hoping that next Saturday, when they're having a garden party, we may be in a position to offer a little bit of hospitality for them as well, and we'll be pursuing that later. But for now, just to say that this is kind of a riparian zone for our church. This is an edge place where we can step out, maybe put our foot into the water a little bit, but be particularly mindful and attentive to what it requires to provide this bridge. And in fact, one of the really affirming things about the meeting on Monday with the Madres is they were actually referring to this experience here at St. Paul's as providing a bridge for them, a bridge from their community into a larger community to take new roots, to grow new connections. And so I hope all of you will rejoice with me in the way in which we are stewarding our neighborhood, our watershed, and growing into God's call for us to be good stewards. So thanks be to God. Amen.